Welcome to the first lecture of CVSP 203. I am Dr. Courtney Fugate. I teach in the CVSP department and also sometimes in the philosophy department. And it's my pleasure to introduce a new course to you that we've been designing over the last couple of years, a new version of 203. I know you all signing up probably thought that you were taking the 203 of past generations, but this new 203 has been almost completely redesigned. For your benefit, and for this reason, throughout the semester, we'll ask, and encourage your feedback on changes that have been made to the course. Things that you like, things that you don't like, because this really is a new experimental version of 203, and so everything can be changed. Now, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the changes that we have made, so you can see kind of what we've been working towards. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Before I get to that, let me just mention, I hope everyone got a fly sheet. It's extremely minimal because I will put the fly sheet as well as the PowerPoints I'll be using and the video of this lecture on the course website. So all that information will be available to you. So I didn't make a very robust fly sheet. So in this, let me get this going here. Okay, in this newly designed version of CVSP 203, there are a few design elements I just want to briefly mention, and I'm sure your course instructors will tell you about them in the coming days, but I just wanted to mention them here and some of the motivations for them. So first of all, this course, of all the CVSP courses in the core courses, 201 through 204, is the first to have a comprehensive reader, which you can purchase at the AUB Copy Center. So that contains all of the text we will read, along with some guiding questions we've composed, which those will maybe change and be added to in the future. Along with, there's a book that you can buy in the AUB bookstore later, Goethe's Faust, which is not included. So that's the only text not included in the reader. The second new design element is we've paired with this course a new website. So I would encourage all of you to go today and check out this aubcvsp203.weebly.com website. There you will find, so no longer, this is very important, no longer will you find the updated 203 lecture schedule and other information on the AUB link, as in the other courses. The updated schedule that we can change overnight, if we would like to, is on this website. So when you go to that website, I was going to show it to you very briefly, but when you go there, you will see a schedule, you will see the common syllabus, so you don't need a paper copy of that, the common syllabus for all of us, and you will see a link for each of the professors that are teaching this course, and on those pages, they will post the information for their individual classes. On that, you will also see under each of the schedule blocks that there is a button that you can press. It says Explore More, or something like this. And if you press that, that's where you will find the filmed common lectures after they are completed, the PowerPoints, and additional information on each of the authors. So I hope that is useful to you, and please let us know if that is in the future, but have a look. The third design element is that we've reduced the number of common lectures. All of us in CVSP are painfully aware that students haven't often enjoyed the common lectures and found them as useful as they could be. And so we've made some changes to try to improve that. One of the changes we've made is that we've reduced the number of common lectures to having one common lecture for each group of texts that we read. So the course is divided into several blocks, 4 blocks, including an introduction, and a series of texts in each block. Now, so the lectures are going to not concern, as they did in the past, all of you probably took 201 or 202, the lectures then concerned one author, one text at a time. Instead, in this course, the model is to look at multiple texts in a kind of discussion, right? So the lectures will be thematic, and they will focus on bringing these texts together. And so there are many fewer texts. In addition to that, we've integrated what we are calling, as you can see here, introducing enrichment events or lectures. So these are lectures that are unrelated to the texts. They're not textual exegesis like we tend to do in these. And we're going to invite people from outside CVSP to come who are specialists on certain topics to give us some contexts for the texts that we read. One of the key ideas in CVSP is that we don't read texts through one discipline. We read them as part of worlds, right? And we understand that to understand a text fully means understanding it in its world and all the various political, philosophical, scientific, artistic dimensions that brings. And so one way of improving this course for us, we thought, would be to bring in those and have lectures that are specifically address the larger context and show you a lot of visual material and other things. In that vein, this semester you'll see 3 new enrichment lectures, or 2 enrichment lectures and 1 enrichment event. Next week you'll see a lecture by Jihad Tuma of the physics department talking about the astronomical revolution, and it'll be much more sciencey than anything I'll talk about today. Joshua Norton will then give a lecture on the instruments of science. So we're going to talk a lot about the theory of science, the background of science, the justification of science in the modern period. But it's quite interesting to know what that science looked like, what it practically involved. So that lecture will have something to do with this. And a very exciting thing we're going to do later in this semester is we have there's a new theater initiative at AUB run by Robert Myers and Sahar Asaf, and we've paired with them to arrange a 2-hour reading of Goethe's Faust. And this is a dramatic reading. You will be involved. We'll perhaps have people who are actors involved. It's still being designed, but it sounds like it's going to be very interesting. And what that will do is put Goethe's Faust, so we'll read Goethe's Faust in a very intellectual way in this course, since we're reading it against the background of philosophy and all kinds of other things. But that will bring in some of the performative aspects of the play, another sense of the context. So I hope that you enjoy those. We'll also be showing twice screening Shakespeare's Hamlet when we come to that. So that's another final design aspect of the course is we've selected a whole bunch of new kinds of texts to put together into these groups. And the basic idea was that we wanted to diversify the kinds of texts in courses like this. The previous 2 or 3 was very heavy on philosophy and political theory. Now there's tons of literature, there's lectures, there's poetry. There was not poetry in previous versions. And so we've got a whole bunch of different kinds of texts that speak to one another in different registers. So that's very exciting. We also diversified the authors. In a course like this, you'll see we're talking mainly about Europe, but it's very important to realize that in talking about any period, there is almost no unanimity in what's going on. And so it was important to us to get texts from Italian authors and French authors and German authors and to read them alongside one another when they're talking about the same topics so that you can see through the eyes of these different cultures. And finally, each block is focused on divergent views. So when you read these first texts and the texts in, say, the next block on the scientific revolution, I would encourage you to think of these texts as texts that are in controversy with each other. We chose them because they take different sides of one and the same issue, and so they speak to one another. They create debates. And so rather than tell you what the modern period or the making of the modern world means, as if we had some answer to that, we're encouraging you to enter into that discussion, right? So also, as I say, for any of these things as you go through the semester, please give us your feedback, if you have any. So now I'm going to turn a little bit to the content of the course. And in doing so, I'm going to do 3 things. I'll just tell you here what the limits of the course are, and then I'm going to give you kind of a snapshot of history before this course kind of starts, before the texts start, and a snapshot of what comes after that, so we can see what kinds of changes took place in the period we're going to discuss. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up this lecture talking about a couple of the major themes that we see in this period and that you'll see repeated in all kinds of different configurations and from different points of view in the texts to come. So the scope of the course, as you've noticed perhaps by now, the course is terribly named. It should not be called The Making of the Modern World. It should be something like The Making of the Modern World, Europe, right? Because we really do limit ourselves to European intellectual history from the late 16th until the early 19th century. So essentially date-wise from the 1550s to the 1830s, often called the modern period. The early part of this is often called the early modern period. Geographically, we limit ourselves to Europe. We won't read anything about the American Revolution or things going on in North and South America, nothing in Asia, nothing in Africa, and so on. So we really are focused on European intellectual history. Hopefully in the future there will be another course that complements this that talks about other regions as well. So let me begin with my snapshot. So the course begins, the first text we read is Copernicus on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres in 1543. And so it's very important in looking at these texts to see what kinds of struggles, what kinds of transitions take place between 1550 and 1830. We're speaking about the same geographical region, but if you were living in 1550 and you were transported to 1830, the world would be completely transformed. It would be transformed from something you would not recognize 1550 if you were in it. It would be a foreign planet. But if you went to 1830, it would be kind of quaint. Right, and I want to give you some of the contrasts that you would recognize, so that we can see these texts are kind of creating that transition. So, if you looked at Europe kind of externally around 1600, by then it had been nearly 100 years since the discovery of the Americas and the circumnavigation of the globe. So the idea of exploration is quite potent in the texts we'll read, the idea of a new discovery. But in a certain sense, it's been around for a while. It's been 100 years, right? And by this time, the Spanish had conquered the Incas and the Aztecs, all the stuff you learned about in high school. And Europe, some people had started to have qualms about the horrors and the tragedies that happened there. But for the most part, Europe was marching forward. Right? You will see, though, Bruno, one of the first texts, he makes a reference to the discovery of the Americas and the horrors that took place there. Right? So there is starting to be in Europe some sense of guilt over what happened. However, at the same time, the slave trade of Europe is in full swing. By 1700, Europe will have hold the most slaves around the world that it ever will, about 6 to 12 million slaves. Gold and silver that came from those ages of discovery will be fueling Europe's wars. And trade with China and other places in the world. Socially and politically, around 1600, you'd find that until the Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517, the Catholic Church was really the only European institution, pan-European institution, and that it largely determined the intellectual life of the people. It had the authority to condemn and to punish scientific or philosophical doctrines, and it often did so. Not just, of course, we'll discuss a bit Galileo later in the course, but many other condemnations throughout the centuries came down on all kinds of seemingly unimportant philosophical questions, right? So this was something the church was constantly making sure that philosophical texts and ideas were in line. At this time, all major universities were Catholic. So if you went to the university, you'd be going to a Catholic university, right? You'd be going there primarily as a monk to learn scholastic philosophy. The framework of education would have been within the church, and it would have been Catholic. There was no public education. The first Protestant universities began to emerge in 1550 through 1575, and they essentially followed the same model as the Catholic universities. They simply tried to replace them. At this time, there was no public education, if you can imagine that. There were no public services, or things like orphanages and houses for the poor, things that are very much central to the way we live today, did not start to emerge until the 1600s. Right? Actually, some of the first ones in Germany were Protestant in the 1660s. Religious institutions for the poor were very scarce. There were no public banks. There was no such public structure or set of institutions. Within this world, the place and value, you would soon realize, of the individual was determined largely by their situation in a fairly rigid class system, determined largely by your father's job and his lineage. So, as you've all probably learned in high school, this was still in this period something like what is called the feudal system was present. You had the nobility, and if you read the history of the times, it's essentially fights between nobility for land. People and their rights and nation states and things don't exist. It's largely skirmishes between noble families and between the church. So society would have been divided essentially into the nobles, the merchants, The church had its own legal system, and priests and others did not participate, were not under the normal laws. They had a separate system for themselves. And you had the number of guilds and then common people, the peasants. So you're probably very familiar with this kind of a social structure. But this is about just before 1600. Continuing politically and socially, from about 1600 to 1650, all of Europe was mired in religiously motivated wars. Nothing could be more important for understanding some of the texts that we're reading. Europe was ravaged by wars between Protestants and Catholics between this time. The English Civil War, which will loom large in the background of Hobbes and Locke that we'll be reading. In this, it concerned the authority of the church and its relationship to the king, Charles I, who was beheaded in 1649, and the relation of the king to the parliament, which was essentially a group of landed nobility and their concerns for certain rights. All of continental Europe itself was ravaged by the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648. And just to get some sense of how devastating this war was to Europe, 8 million people died, which is over 10% of the population, and particularly in Germany. If you notice, when we look at some of the dates of things happening in Germany, they always happen later than elsewhere in Europe. That's because Germany was so devastated. In fact, in one of the towns, they said, a famous writer of the time said, after the 30 Years' War, the only thing left in Germany were soldiers and prostitutes. That was all there was left, right? So some German states lost as much as 75% of their population at this time. And now, as you can imagine, in a time of such devastation, people are going to go towards religion, and not just towards good, solid religions, but towards superstition. So this is also a period where superstition becomes rampant in Europe. Just to give you some idea, from 1615 to 1630, Europe saw the outbreak of all kinds of religious superstition, among which were the witch hunts that are quite famous. All kinds of books were now being published on how to identify witches, and by 1750, there were at least 50,000 executions of witches around Europe. So you will also see in this text rationalism. Why is everyone so interested in rationalism and dispelling prejudice and superstition? It's not because they're simply attacking the Catholic Church and normal church practice. They're also attacking and fighting a real battle against people who defend the idea of things like witches, right, and superstitions. So this is quite an important topic. Now, intellectually, if you were living around this time, you would find that the framework for science and philosophy were provided by a kind of unstable fusion between the work of Aristotle, the ancient philosopher and teacher and student of Plato, and Catholic doctrine. I say it's unstable because there were many things in the Aristotelian philosophy that actually conflicted with religious doctrine, and so there was always a back and forth where the Aristotelian schools of thought got in conflict with the church, and the church condemned something they said about infinity or about numbers or something like that because it didn't seem to fit with church doctrine, and they would go around in circles that way. At this time, if you were an intellectual, you didn't think of yourself as a French intellectual or a German intellectual or anything of the sort. You were a Catholic intellectual. And you didn't, if you were born in France, it didn't really matter because you, like all other people studying in the universities, spoke Latin. You could move all over. There was kind of a pan-European sense of intellectual camaraderie, at least among Catholic speakers or Catholic believers. But at this time, there were no scientific institutions, no state-funded scientific institutions. As you can see, the Royal Society of Britain, these societies have been so important in the development of modern science. It was first founded in 1660, the French Academy in 1666, and the Prussian Academy of Sciences in 1700, again, much later. Prussia is the German region, if you don't know. There were no journals, there were no avenues for publishing scientific research or having it reviewed. For the most part, when people made discoveries, their first thought was to hide them, not to share them and have them reviewed. Because if you hid them and you revealed them at certain times, you could get some kind of benefit from it, right? The question wasn't, could you benefit society? Could you improve the world? The question was, could you improve your standing as a person, as an individual? Get a famous patron to pay you some money to learn your secrets. Bruno did a lot of this. actually. Until almost 1700, the only way for proper scientific or philosophical research to take place was by finding a wealthy patron, who then saw your work as a kind of ornament for their family name. Even Galileo, in the 1600s, the only way he could do his work properly was by being employed by the Medici family to teach geometry to their children. And so when he discovered, he famously looked through a telescope and discovered the moons of Jupiter, and in his, trying to get a little more favor out of the family, he called them the Medicean stars. We don't call them the Medicean stars anymore, but that just a kind of symbol there of how people thought and how intellectual achievements were kind of subsumed under the greatness of noble people. Also, this time there were no public repositories of learning. There were no dictionaries you could go find. Of course, the priests and the monks had some dictionaries of Latin and Greek that they would use, but that was not available to anyone, and most people did not read. They had no education. So there were no dictionaries, no encyclopedias, no way of looking up any kind of information or checking anything. Nothing whatsoever of the kind. Culturally, in around 1600, there was no such thing as what we would now call European culture. There were not even national identities at this time. The closest to this was the culture of the church and that of the individual noble families. Local cultures, spoken languages, folk art and folk poetry, things that we think are important and should be collected and studied and kind of are intrinsic to the value of human beings, these things were not valued. Significant art in the period was either funded by the church or by wealthy patrons. In the same vein, individuality, uniqueness, creativity, having imagination, these were all generally characterized as negative things rather than positive things. There's a kind of a nice story about this. When I was a graduate student, I was reading some older texts with a friend of mine, and we noticed that when they went over the mind, they said almost nothing about the imagination. And the person I was speaking to said, well, of course they must have something more on the imagination somewhere. And then we suddenly realized that actually no one before about the Romantic period, so towards the end of the period we're going to be reading, thought the imagination was anything important. It was actually the quickest way to make mistakes. It was about making pictures of things, and the only thing the imagination could do is really picture them correctly or incorrectly. So creativity would have been making up nonsense at the time, right? And so creativity, you can think about it. No one wanted a creative interpretation of the Bible. That was the last thing they wanted, or a creative interpretation of Aristotle. Those were things that would get you condemned rather than valued. With only a few exceptions, then, all important philosophy, science, and literature was composed in the Latin language, a language not spoken or understood by the general population. The first university lectures in the German language, for example, were held first in the 1690s by a guy named Christian Thomasius, and he wore a sword when he lectured to show kind of what a rebel he was. And this was thought extremely dangerous, and it was only possible at a university that was founded by Protestants and early Enlightenment thinkers. In fact, Thomasius was famous as being the father of the German Enlightenment. So Europe in 1830, now flip to Europe in 1830. The number of changes, the change of face is unimaginable, and I can only mention a few very basic things that will be important in this course. First of all, in 1830, looking again externally, Europe holds colonies, of course, but Europe's attitude towards things like slavery have drastically changed, and by 1833, the British Empire actually outlaws or abolishes slavery. At this time, of course, and I'm not going to say much about this because it's kind of obvious, there's an explosion of production and capitalism fueled by technological advances like the steam engine. Now, one thing to notice, you might be surprised at how early this happened. This happened already in the mid-1700s. The steam engine was invented in 1712. So when you're reading Kant, and he's writing in the 1780s, Even I myself, I'm a Kant scholar, I tend to not think of steam engines in his world. I still kind of tend to put him back with Descartes and pre-scientific revolution in some ways, or pre-technological revolution. But we should realize that's really transforming and making the world much more, opening the world for business and for trade and for industry. The unity at this time that was once provided to Europe by the Catholic Church has almost entirely disappeared. And with it, the use of Latin, as well as the Church's hold on philosophy and science. Something that was painfully evident in 1650 is simply not even thought of anymore in 1830. After some battering, in the text we will read, you'll see Aristotle gets battered quite a bit this semester. He ends up becoming just another philosopher. If you can see, there's a little sad face. He becomes sad. At one time, during as I said, the Catholic Church's philosophy, and the philosophy that was throughout for almost 1,000 years promulgated as the philosophy, was a fusion of Aristotle and the Church. And Aristotle was often referred to as the philosopher, right? He was the one. There were some other people who did Aristotle's-like stuff, but he was the one. And by 1830, Aristotle's kind of quaint, right? So we'll see how that happens and why that happens. At this time in 1830, there are extremely strong national identities. The people have developed to a point where they see their individual national cultures, their lands, their languages, things that in many ways didn't even exist in 1550, as essential to their identities and as binding them into kind of unities opposed to one another, right? Many of the nations by now have constitutions, or had constitutions at some point in this period, recognizing that human beings have intrinsic rights, one of which is individual freedom, whatever that might mean, and that political power ultimately derives from the people, not from the king or from the church. Individuality and creativity are recognized as intrinsically valuable. Indeed, there's a great deal of work and energy being devoted to funding creative projects, to collecting creative results into all kinds of things, right? All this folk art and folk poetry begins to be collected. Not only are, as I say in the next point here, are spoken languages and folk poetry and art valued at this point, a sense of world literature is emerging among some, particularly in Germany. And these have even become the objects of whole disciplines. Right? At this time, fully established and highly complex scientific institutions exist, and scientific culture has developed. Many new fields of scientific study have come into existence following the model of physics. So before, in 1550, 1600, there were no such fields as philosophical aesthetics, political science, social science, psychology, anthropology, economics. These did not exist. And now they are fully flourishing in a period of 1830. You may, in the back of your mind, as you're reading some of these texts, recognize that something like Kant, we're going to read Kant later in the course, he invented, in many ways, the field of anthropology. So not only were these people fighting for new ideas, but they were also establishing many of the fields that you are studying at this time, at this university. So in summary, through this contrast, we can see that the period we will study in this course witnessed an almost complete transformation in the way people living in Europe valued and understood almost everything, themselves, their fellow human beings, and the universe in which they lived. For them, this transformation was an incredibly complex and contentious struggle, the ultimate outcome of which they were rarely able to anticipate. In fact, we'll see some, when we read Francis Bacon later in the course and other writers, we'll see some glimpses of what they think a future scientific world might be like. And it's completely crazy. It's nothing like the world turned out. So do recognize that when you're reading the people involved, they don't really know what the outcome is going to be of their arguments. They have some ideas, but history is much more complicated than that. Now, for us, this poses a challenge of the imagination that is almost impossible for us to meet. we must first recognize that many of the achievements of the modern period are second nature to us. We never have trouble even imagining they did not exist or were not obvious. We must then strain to understand a world in which they were not second nature and in which they were in fact undesirable, forbidden, or perhaps even undreamt of. Finally, with these new eyes, we must attempt to follow the authors we will be reading both critically and sympathetically to try to understand something about the genesis of our own worldview. So that's the end of my snapshot section. I hope that was a bit fly through some things. You probably you had some flashbacks to high school there, some of your history courses. But I think it's very important to have all of this, try to have all of this in mind as you enter and read these texts to see what's at stake in them. So now I'm going to turn to talking about a couple of major themes. Now, just to say beforehand, I'm going to call these major themes. I've got 3 major themes. I may not get through all of them in this time. But these major themes I've kind of developed myself as hooks to try to grapple with what's going on in this period. So these are kind of I'm offering you some kind of ideas. I'm sure Nadia in her sections will have another idea of what's going on in the period, her great themes that she'll focus on as the course develops. But these are just some of mine, and I invite you to think about them throughout the course, but also to find your own. So my first great theme I want to talk about is revolution, and I kind of chose this because the first text we're reading is Nicholas Copernicus is on the revolution of the heavenly spheres, and if you look at this period, it's just full of revolutions. The American Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, all kinds of revolutions take place. And so it's interesting to think about the idea of revolution. So as I said, we begin this course by reading a work by Nicholas Copernicus on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. It was published in 1543, and as I'm sure you know, it argues for a model of the universe with the sun at its center rather than the earth. Now, there is something profoundly symbolic in opening a discussion of the 17th and 18th centuries with a text on the celestial revolutions. The word revolution comes from the Latin language and originally refers to just the circular, regular, and eternally repeating motions of the objects we see in the night sky. That was its first and main use of the term. Revolution in this sense means a turning back or a returning to the point of departure again and again endlessly. Of course, as things in the sky revolve, the sky itself changes the way it appears to us. And so to revolve or to undergo revolution soon gained, particularly in poetic writings, the sense of altering or changing. Finally, in 1688, this term revolution gained its well-known political meaning through its being attached to the so-called Glorious Revolution, in which a very strange thing happened. William of Orange, who was the steward of the Dutch Republic, just came and took the crown of England from James II. And it's also called the Bloodless Revolution because he just showed up and said, I want the crown, and he said, okay, you can have it. But that was also called the Glorious Revolution. Now, that's the first time the term revolution was used to talk about what we talk about now, political revolutions. And of course, it was later used to describe the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and others. Now, the notion of revolution, as I've described it, clearly contains a paradox of sorts. Which we will see play itself out as in nearly all of the texts that we will be reading this semester. On the one hand, it means a radical upheaval and change, the dawning of something new, but also at the same time it means a turning back to the beginning, a restoration of things back to their original and best constitutions. So do revolutions take us forward, or do they take us back, or do they do both at the same time somehow? This tension or paradox, as I've called it, is part of what makes the theme of revolution so appropriate to the change of mind that takes place in the 17th and 18th centuries. It forces us to pose questions that are really at the heart of the texts themselves. As an example from this week's reading, consider the work I mentioned a moment ago, Copernicus's On the Revolutions. Ask 100 scientists, historians, or philosophers about the single most important work that cemented the scientific revolution and symbolized the new outlook of the scientific age to which we still belong. Undoubtedly, most, if not all, will hesitatingly refer to Copernicus's work. And in fact, if you look at this top quote here, I wrote that sentence in my lecture, and then I Googled scientific revolution, and in the first paragraph of the Wikipedia article, I found this statement. While its dates are debated, the publication in 1543 of Nicholas Copernicus's On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres is often cited as marking the beginning of the scientific revolution. So I wasn't off basis there. Now, undoubtedly, just a second. Now, if we read the work itself, we get a very different impression. Copernicus, in the text, never speaks of a new or revolutionary theory. Instead, he tells a story that we will see repeated in many texts this semester, particularly, however, in Descartes. And here's the story he tells. It's the text here I'll be reading. He says, "For a long time, then, I reflected on this confusion in the astronomical traditions concerning the derivation of the motion of the universe's spheres. I began to be annoyed that the movements of the world machine, created for our sake by the best and most systematic artisan of all, were not understood with greater certainty by the philosophers. For this reason, I undertook the task of rereading the works of all the philosophers which I could obtain, to learn whether anyone had ever proposed other motions of the universe's spheres than those expounded by the teachers of astronomy in the schools. And in fact, first I found in Cicero that Hippias supposed the earth to move. Later, I also discovered in Plutarch that certain others were of this opinion. Therefore, having obtained the opportunity from these sources, I too began to consider the mobility of the earth. And even though the idea seemed absurd, nevertheless I knew that others before me had been granted the freedom to imagine any circles whatever for the purpose of explaining the heavenly phenomena." So, as we read here, Copernicus, disturbed by the general disagreement and disorder in astronomy at large, found his way back. He turned back to one of the oldest of all astronomical theories. However, he justified his reconsideration of a seemingly absurd idea by recalling that once before others had been granted the freedom to do so. This same return to what is most ancient was central to the way Copernicus was also understood by many of his followers, including Giordano Bruno. So here's a quote from this week's reading, Bruno speaking about Copernicus. He says, "Who then will be so rude and discourteous toward the labors of this man Copernicus as to forget how much he accomplished, and not to consider that he was ordained by the gods to be the dawn which precedes the rising of the sun of the ancient and true philosophy." You kind of see the paradox there. The rising of the sun, something new coming, of what was ancient, of the true and ancient philosophy. "For so many years entombed in the dark caverns of blind, spiteful, arrogant, and envious ignorance." So this is just one literal way in which we find revolutionary ideas originating in an attempt to return to the beginning or to an original standpoint. In many other texts we will read this semester, the notion of such a revolution or return functions more theoretically than historically. For instance, Francis Bacon and René Descartes will both try to revolutionize science by returning us to the original state of reason before it was corrupted by false doctrines and prejudices. Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau will all try to reconstruct the roots of political authority by having us return, at least in our minds, to our first state of nature before governments emerged. What these and similar authors seem to share is the conviction that the way forward, the real revolution, can only result from a radical break with the present state of things, so that we can go back to the beginning and start all over again on the true or best path. So it's the end of my first great theme, and I think it's quite an interesting idea. So I'd like to hear from some of you, particularly in my classes in the semester, if you see this theme coming back in various ways I may not have thought about in the text. Now, the second great theme I'll go through rather quickly. I call it uprooting radical error. This is a theme we'll see particularly present in the first couple of texts we'll read in speaking about the scientific revolution in the next 3 weeks, in fact. So this brings me directly to my second theme, the uprooting of radical error. This title is intended to be a bit of a pun. The word radical, like the word radish, the red vegetable we all eat, some of us eat, derives from the Latin word radix, which means root, like the root of a plant. If something is radical, that means that it penetrates down to the roots of something. It infects the very foundation. So when I speak here of radical error, I don't just mean a regular mistake or an accident easily corrected, but rather a kind of error that pervades and in some sense belongs to the roots of human judgment and the nature of the intellect itself. Now, if something is diseased with error in its roots, it is very hard to see how you can get rid of that error without uprooting the thing itself. But of course, with the human intellect, that is hardly possible. We are left then with the seemingly paradoxical task of trying to use something essentially corrupted to correct itself. But is that even possible? Now, nearly all of the writers we will be reading early in this semester embrace this paradox in some form or another and attempt to offer a way forward. Why they do this is largely determined by their special historical situation. As I said when speaking of revolution before, one of the predominant ideas of the time is that matters have reached such a crisis point that the only way forward is through a return to the beginning of things. Now, whether that is a historical or merely theoretical beginning, one has in either case to provide a guarantee that the same mistakes will not be repeated. But even more than this, one has to provide a plausible explanation of two seemingly contrary things, which the notion of radical error captures quite well. First, one must explain how it is that for more than 1,000 years, human beings have been on the wrong path in science, politics, religion, in basically everything, such that the true and the false, the good and the evil, had for so long occupied each other's places. If error is rooted in the very nature of the human mind, then this can be explained, of course. However, and this is the second point, thinkers of this period must also be able to explain how it is still possible to avoid such mistakes, how they have avoided such mistakes, using basically the same instruments as their predecessors, namely the human mind itself. To draw on a simile employed by Francis Bacon, the task facing such thinkers, according to their own description, is like that facing the inventors of the telescope. What they found was that as you build larger telescopes, and this is relevant to I'll speak about this slide in a moment. As you build larger telescopes, the very glass lenses that they were made from introduced greater and greater aberrations of color and shape. So the larger you tried to build telescopes, the more the lenses themselves introduced error and aberration. The instrument to see was itself preventing them from seeing. In the same way, on this view, the human intellect would seem to have in its nature always a defect that deflects it from its proper orbit and creates aberrations when it tries to discover the truth. So how, if at all, can such a paradox be resolved? Like the early inventors, thinkers of this period argued that in some form science could provide a solution. In the case of the telescope, it was realized by Leonhard Euler, a mathematical genius, that if you understood the laws of refraction very precisely, you could use that knowledge to design lenses to correct those aberrations. What was so clever about this was the realization that you could use the same qualities that produced the confusion in one lens to exactly cancel out the confusion in another lens. So that, in a sense, two errors very precisely coordinated could result in seeing the truth. As we'll see this semester, Bacon, Descartes, Kant, Herder, and others proposed to perform this same kind of trick, though by different and often contrary means. They each, in their own way, present a theory of radical error, one according to which error is something that we will never be rid of, but have to constantly try to correct for. And they describe in detail various devices or methods through the constant application of which they think we can finally correct the way we think and judge. This, as we will see, holds as much for judging truth as for judging moral matters, what is good. And so here, this is a nice picture of what I was talking about. You get an aberration because glass refracts different wavelengths of light at different angles. And so that's fine if you have a small lens, but if you have a large lens, then this difference between the colors becomes very large. And so you get a blurry image. There's also something called spherical aberration. And Euler discovered that if you have two pieces of glass with different refractive indexes, that they could be used to cancel out each other's aberrations, which is a very clever idea. But the idea there is you're using aberration, but very precisely understood through a mathematical theory to precisely construct a kind of solution. Let me see how I'm doing on time here. Okay, I will move on then to a few minutes. It's the time 47. In fact, I think what I'll do is I will end here and I will post the rest. I have another 4 or 5 pages that I'm not going to let you sit through. But I will post those on the website. That concerns, it's quite interesting. It's about the kind of ideas of systematicity and the new system of the world that we see in Bruno and others. I wish I'd been able to get to that, but I hope you all will take a look. Thank you very much for your attention.